Good morning, everybody. That's funny. It's good because actually, you don't need to know about me. You need to know about Claude Shannon. So a short intro is actually good. So thank you guys for being here this morning. I have to admit, I was a bit. Normally, when I speak about the book, this is the book, by the way. See, we've got a fan. Thanks, Mom. Normally, when I speak of the book, I'm actually speaking to audiences that are a lot less technical than the people in this room. And judging by the other panels and other speakers and discussions, I'm actually going to guess that there's at least a fair amount of familiarity with Claude Shannon's work, even if you have less familiarity with Claude Shannon's life. And I assume that that many of you at some point have encountered in your work, information theory, Claude Shannon's paper on cryptography, possibly some of his work in what became computer science. Things like turbo coding originate with Claude Shannon. So feels good to be in a room of people where saying the name Claude Shannon doesn't inspire, totally puzzling looks in a way, because most of you, I imagine, have encountered him at some point in your life. I'm going to do a few things today. I actually like to start with some videos that my co-author and I discovered in the process of researching Claude Shannon's life. About 6-7 years ago, I was reading a book called The Idea Factory, which is a book about Bell Laboratories. And Bell Labs in the 20th century in the United States is, if you sort of imagine tomorrow that Apple, Google, and Facebook all decided to merge into one super company, right? And the United States put them in charge of the phone system. That's about the size and scale that we're talking about. Bell Labs was, in the 20th century, was the second largest employer in the US behind the Defense Department. And it invented, among other things, the laser, touch-tone dialing, the fax machine, long-distance phone calls. They did improvements to the bazooka. They invented the transistor, which is, the reason all of us can get distracted by the technology we have in our lives. And so I read this book, and there's a figure at the center of the book whose name is Claude Shannon, and I had no idea who Claude Shannon was. And as I started learning more about him, I wanted to go and read about his life, and I went on Amazon, and there was no biography. And so I went to my editors at Simon & Schuster, and I said, there really ought to be a biography of Claude Shannon. He lived this extraordinary life, and he played such a key role in different crucial moments in information technology. It just seems like there ought to be something about him. And one thing led to another, and that's what led to the book. But I'll start with some of the videos because I think they show, they don't give you an insight necessarily into his work, but what they do give you an insight into is his character. And this book was very much a look at what makes a genius-level mind like Claude Shannon tick, and what can we all learn from that. So I'll show some of these videos. Okay, let's start with this one.
Hello, I'm Claude Shannon, a mathematician here at the Bell.
Actually, let me give a bit of preamble to this before we start. So, in the mid-1950s, Claude Shannon has already published his famous paper on information theory. That appears in 1948. It's actually the anniversary is this year. He then decides to use his fame to essentially do whatever he wants. So he comes home at night from working at Bell Laboratories, and he and his wife create this machine. This machine is known as Theseus. And what it is it's an early example of artificial intelligence. It's a mouse that he has programmed to be able to solve a maze and then remember the path that it took to get to its end goal. And in 1953, this is really advanced stuff. So he just does this for fun. He and his wife stay up late, they're wiring this mouse, they create this thing, and they bring it into Bell Laboratories, and it sort of knocks the doors off the place. Everybody loves it. They think this is the greatest thing they've ever seen. And so two things happen. The first is Claude Shannon is invited to present it to the board of directors of Bell Labs. And so he does his presentation to the board. And this is the board of the largest company in the United States. So these are very serious people. They are thoughtful people. They're some of the early pioneers in technology. He gives this presentation of this mouse, and one board member is so excited that he goes, "I propose we make Claude Shannon a member of the board of directors." And the rest of the board members sort of like have to calm him down and say, "Look, he's an employee. We can't do that. It's inappropriate." But what they do allow him to do is they actually send Claude Shannon on a national tour with Theseus. So he goes around demonstrating the mouse. Then he gets invited to do videos like this. And the mouse has a moment of fame. And it's this incredible thing for people. In fact, it is profiled in magazines. And in Time magazine, the headline is, "This mouse is smarter than you are."
Laboratory. This is Theseus. Theseus is an electrically controlled mouse. He has the ability to solve a certain class of problems by trial and error means and then remember the solution. In other words, he can learn from experience. Like his classical namesake, Theseus has the problem of finding his way through a maze. His objective is the goal here in the corner. He is now exploring the maze using a rather involved strategy of trial and error. As he finds the correct path, he registers the information in his memory. Later, I can put him down in any part of the maze that he's already explored, and he'll be able to go directly to the goal without making a single false turn. Of course, solving a problem and remembering the solution involves a certain level of mental activity, and something perhaps akin to a brain. A small computing machine serves Theseus for a brain. Of course, Theseus himself is much too small to contain even a small computing machine. And we have placed the brain cells, if you like, of Theseus behind the mirror here. This is a bank of relays, telephone relays. And the job they do for Theseus is similar to the job they do in your dial telephone system. Each time you use your telephone...
So this is where he has to provide an advertisement for the phone company, because if people think their money is going to making mice instead of fixing the phone system, there's going to be some real problems for Bell Laboratories. One of the lessons of Claude Shannon's life is the value in building physical things. He was somebody who wrote papers of great theoretical consequence. I mean, his mathematical theory of information inaugurates an entire field of study. And as one person put it, it came like a bomb. Like nobody knew that he was working on it. He hadn't published papers prior to that. He just arrives in 1948 with this fully formed paper. But Claude Shannon is also a gifted maker of things. He builds one of the earliest chess-playing computers is credited to Claude Shannon. He builds this mouse. He builds a robot that can solve a Rubik's Cube. He plays around with a flame-throwing trumpet. So his son was going to perform at a school function, and he had to play the trumpet. And Claude Shannon, apparently, it's like at the breakfast table, said, "Wouldn't it be cool if when you were playing the trumpet, fire came out of the back of the trumpet?" And so they went and they built a fire-breathing trumpet. And it works, and it's still around to this day. So Claude Shannon is also one of the only people I know whose work is in the pages of journals. These contraptions are, many of them, at the MIT Museum. And so they're on display for everybody to see. And one of the more curious pursuits in his life that is physical, where he also built physical things, is juggling. So Claude Shannon was a very gifted juggler, and he wrote the first serious paper on juggling, but he also took the time to create juggling robots, and I wanted to show some of those.
Constructing these juggling clowns led another mathematician, Dr. Claude Shannon, to become more intrigued with the problem of building a real juggling machine.
Machines like this only give the illusion of juggling. They have a complex mechanism, but the props, as we call them, never actually leave the ground. They're all held up by black wires and so on. And so far as I know, no one had ever built a real juggling machine. It occurred to me that I would like to try to do that.
The juggler's skills cannot yet be engineered. To build a device that could imitate him, Dr. Shannon had to simplify the problem.
When you bounce juggle, the ball is almost stationary, so you're not wasting much energy. All you have to do is give it a little toss like that, and then we'll come back to the same height. So you're saving a lot of energy. One can see how easy it is. Another aspect of this is that the ball is moving slowly when you catch it.
W.C. Fields, Dr. Shannon's juggling machine, lacks feedback. It can't sense variations in its toss or catch, and so must rely only on the repetitive dynamics of the ball's fall and bounce in order to maintain its rhythmical cascade. Cup-like hands help make up for the...
So these are the things that Claude Shannon actually takes a great deal of pride in. He did confess to one weakness. I mean, he had a few weaknesses, but the one he was willing to confess to is that he was able to juggle 3 balls successfully and then 4 successfully, but he could never get 5 down. And this was a great sort of problem for him in his life, was figuring out how to juggle 5 balls. And I guess there's a kind of dividing line between, good jugglers and great jugglers, and he never quite made it over the hump. Luckily he had other things that he had done in his life that gave him some credit. The final video that I want to show is, actually it's not this one, it's one of the things that people ask me occasionally is, okay, great, this guy wrote this paper in 1948, he's a genius, fantastic, why should I study him now in 2018? That mouse is great, but cars drive themselves, so just, cool it with the history. One of the things that Shannon was involved in very early on were the earliest discussions about what had only recently become known as artificial intelligence. And so in the 1950s and 60s and even 70s, computers are being programmed to do a great deal more than people had ever seen before. And Shannon is involved in the ethical debates about how far should we allow machines to go? If we take them to their extremes, will it be the singularity? Will we just annihilate ourselves? Shannon's discussions about those things are, I think, as fresh and relevant today as they were then. He wrote papers on these subjects, he attended conferences on these subjects, and he and the community of people who worked on these issues, you could take much of what they said, wrote, and thought and introduce it into our discussions about these subjects today. It is the case that just a year ago, Elon Musk and Mark Zuckerberg were involved in this sort of epic Twitter war about whether AI was going to be our savior or our destruction. And these are relevant. These are things that were very relevant in Claude Shannon's day. And this is actually a piece of archival footage from a documentary that MIT did in the 1950s, where he's discussing exactly these subjects.
Correct. What would you say those effects would be?
Well, in the direct effects, we're going to put machines to work for us in many ways. By indirect, I mean that we're going to learn many things while we work with the computers that will help us in other fields that we're interested in. For example, in the field of mental health, social problems, and economic problems, just to mention a few.
Well, how do we put the computer specifically to work?
Well, my colleague at MIT, Professor Norbert Wiener, says we're living through the second industrial revolution today.
The first industrial revolution being the replacement of manual labor by machinery.
That's right. Mm-hmm.
And the second, then, you say, will be the assistance of the human mind by the computer.
And I'm certain that as time goes on, we're going to find ways to do many things using the computer which the unaided mind just could not do by itself. The future of the computer is just hard to imagine. Let's listen now to Professor Shannon, whom we heard briefly at the beginning of the program. And also, I would like you to remember that when he talks about robots, he doesn't mean, a pretty girl like our good friend Dr.
Roth von?
Yes, Roth von, created at the beginning of the program. But what he really means is machines that can do things that man wants them to do.
In discussing the problem of simulating the human brain on a computing machine, we must carefully distinguish between the accomplishments of the past and what we hope to do in the future. Certainly the accomplishments of the past have been most impressive. We have machines that will translate to some extent from one language to another, machines that will prove mathematical theorems, machines that will play chess or checkers, sometimes even better than the men who designed them. These, however, are in the line of special-purpose computers aimed at particular specific problems. What we would like in the future is a more general computing system capable of learning by experience and forming inductive and deductive thoughts. This would probably consist of three main parts. In the first place, there would be sense organs akin to the human eye or ear, whereby the machine can take cognizance of events in its environment. In the second place, there would be a large, general-purpose, flexible computer programmed to learn from experience, to form concepts, and capable of doing logic. In the third place, there will be output devices, devices in the nature of the human hand, capable of allowing the machine to make use of the thoughts that it had, or the cognitive processes, in order to actually affect the environment. Work is going on all of these fronts simultaneously, and rapid progress is being made. I confidently expect that within 10 or 15 years we will find emerging from the laboratories something not too far from the robot of science fiction fame. In any case, whatever the result, this is certainly one of the most challenging and exciting areas of modern scientific work.
Exciting and challenging, but doesn't it worry you?
Well, sure, it worries me. But you know, the problems posed by the computer are really no different than the problems we have with other products of technology. It's going to take a great deal of wisdom on our part to manage them, but if we do, we're going to make a much better world.
Thank you, Dr. Wiesner.
I love the bow tie. It's my favorite part of the whole thing. We chose the title for this book, A Mind at Play, because one of the lessons from Claude Shannon's life is how much wisdom you can actually extract from seeing your work as play. For Claude Shannon, he built juggling robots. He was also nominated for the Nobel Prize. He was interested in chess-playing computers and flame-throwing trumpets, and a mathematical theory of communication was for a long time the best-selling academic book of all time. And there was real value for him in seeing both those seeing all of his pursuits as play. He saw great joy in developing information theory. He found great joy in building Theseus the mouse. With that said, given where we are, I wanted to read a selection from the book because it's actually his first or second trip to London. And it shows a bit of his personality that I think you'll get a kick out of. And it's one of those moments where it's a small anecdote that speaks to the kind of person he is. Among Shannon's most, I'll start here. Not even the Oxbridge style of high academic decorum could dent his flippancy. When Shannon was awarded a visiting fellowship to All Souls College in Oxford in 1978, he had the opportunity of reuniting with John Pierce and Barney Oliver for the university's Trinity term. The trio, along with their fellow Bell Labs alumnus and reunion organizer Rudy Kampfer, were expected to give a series of lectures on topics of research and interest, artificial intelligence, information theory, and so on. Notes passed between Kampfer and Pierce testified to their concern about Shannon's willingness to deliver the lectures. Quote, "To get something out of Claude may be the problem." Claude was pondering a serious problem, though, or at least a serious problem for him. What emerged from the Oxford stint was one of the more curious papers of Shannon's career. Frustrated by having to drive on the left side of the road, Shannon engineered a custom-built solution. Quote, "The fourth dimensional twist, or a modest proposal in aid of the American driver in England," end quote, opens with a tale of the woes of the American driver abroad. This is Claude Shannon. An American driving in England is confronted with a wild and dangerous world. With our long-ingrained driving habits, the world seemed totally mad. Cars, bicycles, and pedestrians would dart out from nowhere, and we would always be looking in the wrong direction. The car was usually filled with curses from the men and screams and hysterical laughter from the women as we careened from one narrow escape to another. The passengers were given to sudden involuntary motions, shielding the face or slamming on non-existent brakes. The turn indicator and windshield wipers were also reversed from American practice, and we found ourselves signaling turns with the windshield wiper, fast for a right turn, slow for a left. The whole driving situation was not particularly improved by the narrowness of English streets and the high speed of English drivers, nor was our inner security increased by the predilection of the English for building stone walls immediately adjacent to the roads. Shannon proposed an idea that even he admitted sounded, quote, grandiose and utterly impractical, the ideal dream of a mathematician. His solution was to create a fourth dimension, one that reversed perceptions of left and right. Quote, how will we do this? In a word, with mirrors. If you hold your right hand in front of a mirror, the image appears as a left hand. If you view it in a second mirror, after 2 reflections, it appears now as a right hand, and after 3 reflections, again as a left hand, and so on. Our general plan is to encompass our American driver with mirror systems which reflect his view of England an odd number of times. Thus, he sees the world about him not as it is, but as it would be after a 180-degree fourth-dimensional rotation. Finally, a series of adjustments to the steering system would translate the American driver's motions into British English. Turning the wheel left would make the car go right, and vice versa. Complete with drawings, figures, and schematics, the paper was, of course, written with tongue firmly in cheek, but it remains the most memorable record of Shannon's time at Oxford. And at more than 2,100 words, it was not simply a throwaway idea. It shows Shannon's willingness to spend hours fleshing out the implications of a joke, as well as his imperturbable indifference to the honors that came his way. And it speaks, perhaps, to the minor anxieties of a world traveler who mainly found travel something to be tolerated, who would just as soon have brought his home with him, even if only as an optical illusion. I thought some folks in the audience might get a kick out of that. Shannon was frequently the kind of person who would win an award and then not go through the trouble of accepting it. So he hated travel. He enjoyed being at home. He had built a 2-story toy shop in his kind of house where he would spend hours building these devices, playing games, doing all kinds of crazy things. And so he really didn't enjoy travel. His wife did enjoy travel. So he'd get an offer for an honorary degree from some university abroad, and she would have to tell him, like, we're going to go accept this prize. He won the prestigious Kyoto Prize, and he didn't want to go to Japan. He didn't think he would enjoy the food, and so his wife had to talk him into it so that they could have an excuse to go see and visit Japan. But again and again, he was somebody who didn't really care for worldly honors. He didn't care for awards or prizes. He had a brief brush with fame in the 1950s, and he found fame to be very strange and off-putting. So he's invited to do television, he's invited to give lectures, and he just, sort of says, to hell with it, I'm not going to do this anymore. This isn't of interest to me. There's a really great note that he writes back to somebody who invites him to give a talk. This is after his retirement, and he writes back and says, since our retirement, Betty, his wife, doesn't do windows, and I don't do talks. What are the lessons that you can learn from a life like this? What are the things that we can take away for our own practical benefit? My co-author and I spent a lot of time, living with Claude Shannon. We spent 5 years and thousands of hours. We interviewed people who knew him. We found his wife, found an ex-girlfriend, his best friend, his running buddies. We went to Bell Labs. And part of what happened over the course of that time is we started to learn all these lessons that we didn't intend to learn. We didn't go out looking for lessons from Claude Shannon's life. We just thought his life was valuable in its own right, and there was something to be said for learning about the origins of the technology that we live with today. But there are things you can learn, even as somebody, in my case, who's not particularly technical. This is a note from the Shannon papers at the Library of Congress, and it says, "Dear Mr. Vander Herk, you suggested 3 reasons for not receiving a prompt answer to your letter relating to our interview. The correct answer was none of these. It is that I am a chronic procrastinator. However, I am closing at long last a corrected version of our interview. It is amazing how stupid some of the things we say are when transcribed from tape. I've tried to correct grammar, syntax, and content. My apologies for the long delay." Shannon was a chronic procrastinator in one way, which is that he didn't put time and energy into things that didn't have value and that he didn't enjoy. So he had a folder on his desk that had the label, "Letters I've taken too long in responding to." And he would just sort of toss things in there. There are rumors and anecdotes of checks in his office that he was just too lazy to cash, that he would just get these, he'd get royalty checks, he'd get other things, and he was just like, no, that's not of interest to me. And I have found in studying the lives of other interesting and brilliant people in the course of doing the work for this book that they have a way of tuning out the inessential, right? So Shannon, when he was working on information theory in the 1940s, would come home and be very dedicated and very focused late at night. But if someone came into the room, there are stories of how he wouldn't even notice that they were around, right? There's a way in which actually knowing what not to spend your time on or what not to pay attention on is very valuable. And what it shows in Shannon's case is, the kind of stuff that makes up so much of our lives, like email, browsing social media, there's I think something powerful about asking exactly how much value am I getting from that. In Shannon's case, he actually spent so much more of his time building things and writing papers that made such historic contributions to information technology that I don't think any person who wrote to him was ever truly disappointed that Claude Shannon didn't write back. That the people that he may have offended along the way were only too happy to, sort of like they can deal with it. And Shannon didn't care. He didn't care at all. And I think there's something in that indifference that's very powerful. This is a quote from Shannon. "I think I'm more visual than symbolic. I try to get a feeling of what's going on. Equations come later." And one of his students who we interviewed for the book said he had this weird insight. He could see through things. He would say something like this should be true, and he was usually right. You can't develop an entire field out of whole cloth if you don't have superb intuition. Again and again and again, when we would speak to people about Claude Shannon, they would say he had such remarkable intuition. He had such a feel for problems. He just had this sixth sense. And we were speaking to people who were engineers. I mean, these are hard-headed, practical people, people who had spent a lifetime studying a discipline that's about getting at the essence of what is hard-headed and practical. And so to hear words like intuition, sort of this Los Angeles word, was this sort of interesting experience for us. But what I started to realize in looking at, for example, the life of Albert Einstein, was that there really was something to this sense that you can follow, call it gut or your instinct, to come up with at least the beginnings of an answer to problems, right? So for Shannon, part of what he used to do was, in much the same manner as Einstein, he knew what the start of a problem was, and he could see its end state. And once he had those sort of intermediary steps were all filler, right? So a lot of his papers actually were criticized by mathematicians very early on for not being complete enough. They were weak in, I believe what are called converses. And he just simply didn't do a lot of the work that people expected of him. Now, later mathematicians came and kind of proved some of his things correct, but there was value for him in seeing the end state of a project. There's a correspondence when he's talking to somebody who also builds machines, and he says, well, I just try to imagine what the machine is going to look like in its end state, and then I find my way there. And so I think there is value in whatever this thing is. It's hard to pin down, but this idea that you have a feeling about a problem, if you have a feeling about a particularly difficult computer science question, or in my case, a feeling about how a book might look when it's finished, you can kind of find your way there over time. I've been working on 3 different ideas simultaneously, and strangely enough, it seems a more productive method than sticking to one problem. Before I dive into the quote, I'll actually just talk about these. So Shannon was a gifted unicyclist. So he was fascinated by unicycles. He had a fleet of them in his house. He actually used to build them. And at one point, he built a unicycle, and then he said, well, what would this look like if it was smaller? And then he built a second one. He said, well, what would this look like if it was smaller? And he kept going until he had a unicycle that was small enough to fit in the palm of his hand. And there was no reason for this. He just wanted to see what they would look like if he constructed them to exact replicas until they got small enough to fit in his hand. The big wheel bicycle with the top hat, this is one of my favorite photos. And this is his wife, Betty, who was actually one of his most important collaborators. She also had a degree in mathematics, and they would talk math and music and puzzles and stock picking. That was how the family kind of became oriented around mathematics. What they're looking at here is, I think, by some accounts, the very first computer to ever play chess. This was Shannon's creation. It was his idea. He was an avid chess player, and he built a machine that would tell you, it would use lights to simulate what the next move should be. And it was called Endgame because it only played, I think, like the last 6 moves of a game of chess. But it did work, and it's in I believe it's in a museum today. One more story about their family, just because it's funny. The Shannons couldn't do anything like a normal family, so when it came time to deciding how they would do the dishes, they were all seated at a hexagonal table, and they had a wind-up mouse. And what they would do every night is they would wind up the mouse, put it in the middle of the table, and whichever edge it happened to fall off of, that was the person that did the dishes that night. And then I think they went into like elaborate calculations of what the probabilities were, but in any case. The point of the quote is, I think we have a tendency in every field in modern times to preach the virtue of specialization, of getting very, very good at a thing and then continuing, and then just continuing to go into one very, very narrow slice of whatever field you're a part of. Shannon would have found this behavior abhorrent. He explored. He studied everything, from linguistics to poetry. He loved reading Alice in Wonderland, and he had huge sections of Alice in Wonderland memorized. As I've shown, he enjoyed everything from unicycles to juggling to chess, but he was also somebody who worked at the Institute for Advanced Study, at Princeton with John von Neumann, and he had some run-ins with Albert Einstein. There was, to him, though, real value in simply allowing yourself to be intellectually curious. And this sounds like something that's very easy to do. In fact, it's very hard to do, because society and economic pressures kind of push us all to focus on one thing at the expense of focusing on many things. But for Shannon, and I think for many other thinkers at Shannon's level, there's so much value to be extracted from studying different fields of interest. And I think it's worth preaching this kind of interdisciplinary thinking today more than ever, because the pressures on us to do the opposite are so great. This quote is in the first letter that Shannon writes to his graduate advisor, Vannevar Bush, and he's telling Bush about how he started to think about this idea that all information, sound, a message, a poem, telephone call, they're all the same, and they can all be abstracted into bits, right? This is one of the great ideas of the 20th century, and it comes because Shannon has been working at Bell Laboratories on the phone system. He's done code breaking and code breaking analysis and cryptography work for Bell Labs, and he's been doing work on logic and other things at the University of Michigan and at MIT. And he's working on different ideas simultaneously, but out of that stew comes a mathematical theory of information, which is published in 1948 and which people still use to this day. So I don't know that there's a more compelling case for the value of studying things that aren't immediately relevant to the field that you're in. Almost every problem you come across is befuddled with all kinds of extraneous data of one sort or another. And if you can bring this problem down into the main issues, you can see more clearly what you're trying to do. When Shannon was a bit famous, Bell Labs asks him to give a talk about genius, about what it takes to be a genius, because at this point people had regarded him as a genius. Magazines had published profiles of him. He actually had a spread in Vogue magazine, which is kind of funny. He had like a dapper suit on, and he was holding a cigarette and smoking, and it's a long lost issue of Vogue. I'm sure it didn't reach any huge audience apart from the audience at the time, but he gives a speech called Creative Thinking, and my co-author and I actually found this speech buried at kind of page 800 of an appendix of his collected papers. So when his collected papers were published, nobody thought it would be valuable to have a speech from a genius about what it's like to be a genius included. We find the speech, and this is one of the quotes. He gives a 6-step process for how his brain operates on problems. And it's either step 1 or step 2 is to simplify, simplify, simplify. So he is most interested in getting at the essence of a problem, stripping away the inessential, taking out things that don't matter. And my co-author and I actually found this to be a very valuable thing for us to be reminded of as writers. Because as writers, it's so easy to puff up a sentence, to use words with too many syllables, to make yourself sound smart, but actually what you're trying to do, if you're trying to write well, is to write clearly, to get at the essence of a thing. And then he and I started thinking a lot about how Shannon's lessons on these issues actually apply in other fields as well. One of the great, I think, genius moments or ideas of the products that Apple makes that Steve Jobs was fascinated by was the idea of simplicity, of elegance, of having one button, not 10. Now, this can also be parodied, obviously, but in Jobs' case, he took a great deal from the Kyoto Garden. So a lot of the time that he spent in Japan sort of studying the Kyoto Gardens, I gather, made its way into the design and the simplicity of Apple's products. When people talk about Shannon's papers, they talk about their elegance. They talk about how simple they are, how clean they are. I'm not an engineer, I'm not a computer scientist, I'm not a mathematician, and I was able to read a mathematical theory on communication and make pretty good sense of it. His ideas were stripped down to their essence. They were very, very clearly communicated. But I think there is something about approaching simplicity as a problem-solving tactic that's actually very important for all of us to remember, and it's helped me. It's helped me take something that's much too complicated and simply strip the pieces that are making it complex out of the issue and then getting to the heart of it. One of Shannon's graduate students, a man I quoted earlier, Bob Gallagher, talked about how he would go into Shannon's office to talk to him about a problem, and Shannon would sort of sit back and he would say, well, what if you took that part out? And he'd say, okay, what if you took that part out? What if you took this out? And they would go on and on and on until Gallagher would get so frustrated, he'd say, well, all I have here is this simple thing. And then they would sort of look at it, and Shannon would say, well, that's the point. And then they would build back up from that place. That's, I think, the value in a problem-solving approach that prioritizes simplicity. I think I have about 5 minutes left, right? Give or take. Yeah. I'll end with this then. Then there's the idea of dissatisfaction. By this, I don't mean a pessimistic dissatisfaction of the world. We don't like the way things are. I mean a constructive dissatisfaction. The idea could be expressed in the words, this is okay, but I think things could be done better. I think there's a neater way to do this. I think things could be improved a little. In other words, there's continually a slight irritation when things don't look quite right. And I think that dissatisfaction in present days is a key driving force in good scientists. This comes out of that same speech, Creative Thinking. And Shannon is talking about where good ideas come from. Where does genius come from? Where do these great sparks of insight that lead to a mathematical theory of information come from? For him, somewhat to my surprise and to the surprise of my co-author, it came from irritation. He was usefully irritated. He was bothered by something to the point that he needed to fix it. And this, for us, was an interesting nugget from his life. The idea that this person who had developed all these great and amazing things, who had been a pioneer in computing, who had been, lauded the world over, that maybe so much of the work that he was doing was just because he was bothered that there wasn't a mouse that could navigate a maze, that he was bothered that people were thinking about information in a way that he thought was incorrect or at least incomplete. I'm not sure that we ever talk about irritation as the source of great problem solving, but I can imagine that everybody in this room has had an experience where you have to fix something because it's wrong, and maybe that instinct can lead us to more creative insights, more breakthroughs, just by trying not necessarily to look for the problems that are sexiest or most interesting or are going to have the biggest financial rewards, but it's something that just doesn't look quite right that we can solve in a way that no one else can. And if Shannon has many unorthodox lessons to teach us, I think this might be one of the most important, that you can find your way to genius just by being usefully irritated. I could go on and on and on about Shannon, given how much time I spent learning about him, but at this point I'm happy to answer questions. I have with me also 3 copies of the book, to the extent that anybody wants one, but I'm happy to talk about Shannon, his life, or what the process was like researching the book.
Thank you very much. Yes. All right. Okay, fine.
You mentioned Betty Shannon,
Yeah.
and that she was a mathematician. And we hear constantly that there is a great man, and then we hear about the wife that was a collaborator or something, and she ended up being mathematician, physician, something. Do you think there is a need for a book about those great women behind these men?
Oh, well, hopefully, yes. The answer is yes. So we were one of the last people to interview Betty Shannon. So she passed away just before this book was published. And I'm sorry, this is a small aside. One of the more morbid elements of doing a book like this is that 3 of the people who we interviewed passed away while we were writing the book, because these people, these giants of information technology, are becoming older, and they just pass away. So we would interview somebody, and then find out a few months later that they'd passed. It was actually one of the sadder parts of doing the book. But in any case, we interviewed Betty Shannon, and we learned a great deal about her life. I think that Claude Shannon would not have wanted this book written about him, because he was a very modest guy. He was a very self-effacing guy. He didn't go in for this. Betty Shannon would have wanted a book about her even less than Claude Shannon wanted a book about him. But let me just tell you a little bit about her in the interest of kind of sharing some facts. So she gets a full scholarship to what is now known as Rutgers, what was then known as the Douglas College of Women, and she studies math. She plays piano. He played jazz clarinet, so they would play together. That was their first dates, where they would go over to Betty's house, and he would play jazz clarinet, and she would play the piano. And they would just work on math together. So what people, in his archives, there are a bunch of papers, and they're actually papers that say Claude Shannon, but they're written by Betty. So Shannon would actually just talk about the problem, and Betty would sort of write things out and do the math itself. So people would always find it curious that he had they're like, these papers have a very feminine handwriting style. And they're like, well, actually, because it's his wife doing a lot of the work. So I do think they are one of the great mathematical partnerships of the 20th century, and she has not gotten enough credit. And hopefully the book starts to remedy that. And we published an article in Scientific American that got some attention. But she was a brilliant and very practical person, and she kept him deeply focused on actually delivering the papers that he promised he would, or the ideas that he promised he would. And so there are many papers that he ended up publishing in journals that were only published because Betty Shannon said, you have to get this done. Like, you have a career to build, we have a family to support, you need to finish this. And so I do think there's value in that, but she would not have wanted a book written about her at all. It took us 3 years to get Betty Shannon to agree to talk to us, and 3 or 4 years to get his children to talk to us. When they finally did, they were very generous and very open, and actually all the photos that you saw, with the exception of one, come from the Shannon family photo album. So it was, by the end, they were very open.
Sadly, we can't take more questions, but thank you so much.
Oh, of course. I'm happy to stick around after.
And, well, see you later.